they stood alone, with ideas that changed everything. Brilliant minds against the world then.
Welcome to your dose of wowness. There is a door in Vienna that pregnant women in the year 1846 would rather give birth in the street than walk through. Not because of what waited on the other side in some abstract sense, but because the women who went in knew, with hard statistical certainty passed mother to mother in whispers along the cobblestone streets, that nearly 1 in every 10 of them would never walk back out. 20 feet away, through a different door, in the very same hospital, that number dropped to almost nothing. Same illness, same building, same exact kind of patient. One door killed, one door didn't. And the man who finally figured out why would pay for that answer with his sanity, his career, and ultimately his life. He was beaten to death in an asylum, weeks before science finally proved he had been right all along. This is the story of Ignaz Semmelweis, and it is, without exaggeration, the most tragic vindication in the history of medicine. Step right into the grim reality of the Vienna General Hospital maternity ward. I want you to put yourself in the shoes of a pregnant woman arriving at those steps. You're destitute, which is exactly why you're seeking a free bed in a charity hospital to begin with. But the price of that free bed? You become a teaching subject. And worse, you are gambling your life over a coin flip that you have absolutely no power to control. You see, the hospital split its obstetrical service into 2 clinics, and they assigned patients on an alternating day basis. If you arrived on a Tuesday, you lived. If you arrived on a Wednesday, you stood a terrifyingly high chance of developing puerperal fever, or what they called back then, childbed fever. It was a slow, agonizing deterioration. It started with chills and a racing pulse, quickly escalating into severe abdominal pain, a distended belly, and eventually a gruesome descent into sepsis and death. And this often happened within the exact same week you brought a new life into the world. Okay, let's dive into this architecture of death. You're standing in that echoing, poorly lit corridor, right? And you're staring at these 2 clinics. The first clinic is staffed by the highly educated gentlemen of the era, the male doctors and the medical students of the burgeoning anatomical school of medicine. The second clinic? That's staffed exclusively by midwives. If you get assigned to the first clinic, your chance of dying is frequently above 10%, and sometimes it climbs way higher during these brutal localized outbreaks. If you get assigned to the second clinic, your chance of dying is in the low single digits. Women knew this. They understood the lethal geography of this building. They devised desperate, heartbreaking strategies like purposefully feigning labor outside the building just to be examined by midwives in the street. They technically bypassed the admission rules, rather than risk crossing the threshold of the first clinic. And here's the part that should make your skin crawl. The doctors killing these women weren't bad doctors. Some of them were the best in Europe. They were pioneers in internal examination and pathology, which means the thing that was killing mothers by the hundreds wasn't incompetence, and it wasn't a lack of medical education. It was something far harder to fix. If stories like this, the ones history almost let slip through the cracks, are the reason you're here, hit subscribe now, because this is only the first of 10. We're spending the next 10 days on the brilliant minds the world tried to bury. So, let's see how this builds into an almost unbearable detective puzzle. Ignaz Semmelweis is a young, obsessive Hungarian physician working in that first clinic, and he is methodically hunting the killer. He's poring over spreadsheets of death, looking for literally any variable that explains the gap. And he systematically eliminates every prevailing, honestly, kind of absurd theory of the era. He checks overcrowding, thinking it might be a factor of bad air. Well, it's not that. The second clinic is actually vastly more crowded because women are begging to be put there. He tests the physical birthing positions used by the mothers, forcing the first clinic to mimic the lateral positions of the second clinic. It changes absolutely nothing. He even considers psychological shock. There's a priest who walks through the first clinic, ringing this heavy bell to deliver last rites to the dying, a sound that terrified the laboring mothers to their core. Semmelweis hypothesizes that the sheer terror is inducing fevers, so he begs the priest to take a silent alternate route. The priest agrees, the bell is silenced, nothing changes. The mothers keep dying. The frantic tension of this solvable catastrophe is mounting with every passing day, driving Semmelweis to the very edge of despair.
The answer doesn't come from a controlled trial. It comes from sudden, sharp grief. Semmelweis' close friend and mentor, the esteemed forensic pathologist Jakub Kolečka, is performing a routine autopsy with a group of students. Now, dissecting corpses was the absolute cutting edge of anatomical science in 1847. During the procedure, a student accidentally nicks Kolečka's finger with a scalpel. It's just a tiny, seemingly insignificant slip of the blade, but Kolečka falls terribly ill. When Semmelweis examines his friend's symptoms and reads the final autopsy results, he is struck with immediate electric recognition. The systemic collapse, the massive inflammation, the raging fever, it perfectly mirrors the mother's dying of childbed fever. Childbed fever wasn't a disease specific to women or childbirth at all. It was blood poisoning. Kolechka didn't just get a generic infection. He got it because particulate matter from a corpse entered his bloodstream directly.
Now, I want you to consider the horrifying realization this forced upon Semmelweis. Think about the daily routine of the Vienna General Hospital. What were the doctors and students in the first clinic doing every single morning? They were down in the morgue, dissecting corpses to study the anatomy of disease. And then, without washing their hands beyond a cursory rinse with plain soap and water, often simply wiping the biological matter right onto their stiff aprons, they walked straight down the hall and into the delivery room. They were conducting internal examinations on healthy, laboring women. The stench of death literally lingered on their skin. And the midwives in the second clinic? Well, they never performed autopsies. They only dealt with the living. That invisible matter, what Semmelweis frantically called cadaverous particles, was the killer. And the gentlemen doctors were the vehicle.
Semmelweis didn't need a microscope to solve this. He didn't need a sophisticated understanding of cellular biology. He didn't need a single piece of technology that didn't already exist in 1847. He needed one thing nobody was willing to give him: doctors willing to admit their own hands could kill. If you're finding this historical blindness as infuriating as we did researching it, drop a comment with one word: reflex. Because by the end of this explainer, you'll understand exactly why we picked that word. And it's not just about Semmelweis. It's about a deeply flawed human pattern that still runs the world today.
The sheer empirical power of being right is undeniable. In May of 1847, Semmelweis institutes a strict, non-negotiable rule. All physicians and students absolutely must heavily scrub their hands in a chlorinated lime solution before examining any patients. He didn't choose chlorinated lime because he understood bacteria, right? He chose it because plain soap couldn't remove the putrid odor of the morgue, but the harsh chlorine chemical did. The result isn't some gradual improvement. It is a cliff. The mortality rate in the first clinic plummets from roughly 18% down to under 2% almost instantly. The data is utterly unambiguous. The natural experiment is flawless. Mothers literally stop dying. It is a total, absolute victory for empirical proof. But victory is not what happened. The medical establishment looks at this perfect data, looks at the thousands of lives that will be saved going forward, and says, no. Listen closely to this because you have to understand the institutional vanity at play here. Back in the 1840s, diseases were believed to be caused by internal imbalances or atmospheric miasmas, not physical dirt on a physician's hands. Accepting this data meant accepting that the most credentialed elite physicians in Europe had been personally responsible for butchering their own patients for years. It was an existential threat to their class identity as clean-handed gentlemen of science. They actually felt personally insulted by the implication that they were dirty professional vectors of disease. Here's where this story stops being about hand-washing. It becomes about what happens to a man who is completely, provably correct and surrounded by people who would rather destroy him than admit it. The backlash against him is systematic and it is deeply cruel. Semmelweis is working decades before Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch established formal germ theory. He knows exactly what is happening mechanically, but he lacks the modern microbiological vocabulary to defend himself against highly educated critics who basically call his theory primitive and unscientific. So as the medical establishment actively ignores him and just returns to their old ways, and as more women needlessly die on the tables of the first clinic, Semmelweis begins to psychologically fracture. He grows desperate. He loses his temper. He writes furious open letters to prominent obstetricians, explicitly labeling his colleagues murderers and ignoramuses. And this rhetorical escalation gives his sophisticated critics the exact excuse they want. They don't have to engage with his math anymore. They simply dismiss him as an unstable extremist, refusing to renew his contract and eventually pushing him entirely out of his position in Vienna. This tragic dynamic gives birth to a term that still haunts the scientific and professional communities today. It's called the Semmelweis reflex. It's defined as the knee-jerk, violent rejection of new evidence simply because it contradicts established norms, beliefs, or paradigms. I challenge you to look around today. Speak honestly with anyone who has tried to reform a massive, entrenched system. This institutional defense mechanism hasn't gone away, you know? It just wears different suits. When cold, hard evidence threatens an established identity or a lucrative power structure, the evidence is almost always the first casualty. What happens next is the single cruelest piece of timing in this entire series. Stay with us. By the mid-1860s, the psychological burden of watching a highly solvable catastrophe continue uninterrupted for nearly 2 decades completely shatters his spirit. He's drinking heavily, his behavior is erratic, and he talks of literally nothing but the dying mothers.
In 1865, under deceptive circumstances disguised as a tour of a new medical facility, colleagues and his own family have Semmelweis involuntarily committed to an insane asylum in Vienna. When he realizes what is happening and tries to leave, he is brutally beaten by the guards and forced into a straitjacket. During that beating, he sustains a severe wound to his right hand. The wound turns gangrenous. He dies at age 47 from sepsis. Stop and feel the immense weight of that irony. He dies of the exact same family of blood infection he spent his entire adult life fighting to prevent in others. And he dies completely alone, stripped of his dignity, cast out by the very medical community he tried to advance.
Ignaz Semmelweis died in restraints, in an asylum, from an infection, the very family of disease his entire life's work had been spent trying to stop. And less than a handful of years later, Louis Pasteur would hand the world the proof that would have made Semmelweis a hero in his own lifetime, if only it had arrived in time. It didn't. That's not a footnote. That's the whole tragedy in a single sentence. But his name didn't disappear. It became a university, a global hand-washing campaign, and a word we still use for the very human habit of rejecting the truth because it's inconvenient. Tomorrow we stay inside that same unbearable pattern, a mind the world needed desperately, treated by that same world as something to be destroyed rather than protected. If this one stayed with you, you're going to want to be here for what's next. Subscribe and we'll see you tomorrow.